I've changed the title a little here, actually, because my Mr. Williamson of Weston Williamson was originally going to present this talk, and he gave it a very grand title about transit-orientated development, a blueprint for 21st century garden city. I'm Head of Masterplanning at Weston Williamson. We're a quite small practice, but we sort of specialise in railway infrastructure. And I will apologise now regarding all these sort of slides about all the massive amounts of investment that's been put into London's railway infrastructure. I'm from Bradford originally, so hopefully you'll sort of forgive me for some of these sort of slides. So transport-orientated development seems to be a bit of a buzzword at the moment. I joined Weston Williamson at the beginning of 2015, having spent a lot of time in Norway, actually, where there's not a lot of railway building going on because it's got a very small population. It's got a very tricky topography as well in terms of fjords and mountains, etc. Brian has just given that fantastic talk, basically, as I think sort of summed up what my sort of understanding of transport-orientated development is. There's a series of principles sort of here, and again, it's regarding orientating any new development around public transport nodes. What's sort of interesting about this is going back to this, which is something which came out at it was 1999, and it was Lord Rogers, the Urban Task Force. And I think a lot of the principles are actually in there regarding this sort of transport-orientated development. And I think the reason why there's all this talk about TOD at the moment is because a lot of countries' governments are actually investing quite a lot of money in rail. That looks very similar to the Howard drawing, doesn't it, really, the sort of social city. That's another right drawing. But we can sort of see there in terms of the idea of large densities around these kind of major nodes. Nothing new, though, really, in terms of building around sort of railways. If we sort of think, basically, in the sort of early 20th century, in terms of, it was called Metroland, and it was effectively an extension of the first underground railway in the world, which was the Metropolitan Line. And it effectively went off northwest out of London, basically into Buckinghamshire and these counties on the outside, really. At the same time, while you see sort of Le Corbusier there was sort of, that was his own kind of version, I guess, in terms of TOD, which was development based around the car, which is fine. I mean, you know, it's part of sort of history we learn through sort of history. But what's sort of interesting about the whole Metropolitan line extension at the time is that the railway company are in a very fortunate position to actually be able to sort of keep all the surplus land around the railways that were actually sort of building. And what they did do was actually sort of set up a development corporation, which is a Metropolitan Railway Country Estates Limited. And then they were sort of promoting this whole idea about sort of living outside of London. You see, leave this kind of the grimness of whatever that actually maybe move to Edgware. Edgware's a little bit like that sort of nowadays, actually, but nevertheless. And the whole idea about, you know, sort of moving out of the urban sort of centre into this, you know, beautiful sort of green garden city, I guess, really. But very low density. I mean, lovely houses, very nice place to live now, I guess, if you can. Certainly not at that price, obviously. But what's sort of interesting, and again, I apologise for the London thing, but it's because I work there and the other projects I'm working on, is the current sort of demand in terms of land and where sort of people want to live and work. This is the Greater London areas, in the centre in here, you see, basically. But actually, given the amount of railway infrastructure, existing railway infrastructure that London's got, and also new railway infrastructure, this would be a better model, where you actually begin to sort of increase densities and actually build around these railway nodes, as Brian has actually been sort of pointing out there. London, whatever you sort of think about it as a city, basically. It's very green. There's a green space on the left there. Highly dense. Well, actually, no, it's not dense, basically, at all. It's very. It's. If you go into the building centre in Store Street in London and look at that fantastic model that they've got of London, it's just this huge series of villages, you know, which are all grown together, and then suddenly you get these little peaks, basically, which would be sort of Canary Wharf or the sort of city of London. But there's no land. There's effectively no land. All these kind of big areas of white that you sort of see around here tend to be industry in London, and although London is now this, you know, post-industrial sort of city, basically, we still need those sort of facilities within cities. And I'll come on to this a little bit later on regarding sort of Crossrail. So there's a fantastic map, actually, in terms of the railway infrastructure around London. And beyond London as well, really. So how can we sort of make the most of that? As a company, we do a lot of kind of railway sort of upgrades, so we're involved in a lot of these different stations around. The other issue as well is with, so this is the boundary of the Greater London Authority, and this is a Centre for Cities slide actually, which is quite interesting, which sort of shows potential ped sheds, as Sir Brian was sort of saying there, around existing railway infrastructure. Does this actually work? Oh, it does. Railway infrastructure, these sort of purple circles here, so 1 kilometre radius around existing railway. But what it also shows, you see, is the green belt as well, which is obviously a very emotive sort of subject in terms of sort of building on the green belt. But it keeps cropping up with these awful lobbying company groups called, London First. I mean, everybody, gives a name to themselves like that. Needs shooting, really, don't they? But nevertheless. But what's sort of interesting as well is that as part of the London plan, which was written back in 2000, they effectively sort of set up these series of what they call public transport accessibility level matrix, which is to do with it's planning policy really, which is to do with how dense you can actually go around areas where you've got very, very good public transport, and it's not just railway. It's fine if you've got a railway station, but if that railway station only gets 1 train an hour, it doesn't have it's not really sort of connected, basically. Very few people do it. And then also actually adding into things like buses as well, basically, so you get this truly interconnected sort of public transport system. But what it begins to show, they've broken it up into a series of sections where there's a suburban location, urban location, central location. So the higher the PTAL rating goes, up to sort of 6 there, they'll allow development to go into the higher densities, up to 405 units per hectare, whatever that means. It's just numbers, isn't it, really? But it doesn't really mean. We were trying to sort of show this in terms of these sort of slides here, which is about. So we're working a lot on Crossrail 2. Again, a lot of money invested in London, I apologise. And we were kind of looking at what these sort of PTAL ratings mean in terms of densities. This is Crossrail 2, very, very frequent new underground railway. Again, something like 4-tracking. 4-tracking a railway basically means you've got 2 railway lines at the moment, 1 train going one way, 1 going the other. You put 2 more in the centre, it means that the fast trains can go through and the suburban trains can sort of stop. It means you get bigger capacity basically on the tracks. So this is Crossrail 1, basically, which kind of sort of goes from Reading there in the west over to somewhere in sort of Essex, basically. And the cost of it, I mean, it's astronomical, isn't it? And again, I apologise, it's not sort of coming to the north at the moment. 40 stations, 10 new, 24 trains per hour, so-and-so, this, that, and the other. The central section here, most of it's sort of underground. Most of this line here, all these sort of lines, just using existing rail, basically, and existing stations, and just upgrading them to longer trains, 250 metres, higher sort of frequencies. And actually, just going back there to what sort of Phil was sort of talking about, basically with the Jubilee Line. So the Jubilee Line, Weston Williamson did a lot of stations on the Jubilee Line. Cost of 3.5 million at the time. These are the development numbers that kind of came out of those areas at that railway line extension in the 1999, 2000. Actually sort of generated. None of that money is kind of like sort of directly sort of coming back to government to pay for that £3.5 billion worth of investment. Crossrail 1 funding is slightly different, but it's still not great, really. I mean, there's bits and bats of sort of development sort of contributions, selling off land, etc. But what they need to do now, certainly for Crossrail 2, everybody knows where the line is now. All the developers buy up the land. The developers are the ones that are going to make all the money out of it, really, which is worrying. So the TfL released this report at the beginning of the year, was value land capture, and it picks up on a lot of the ones that sort of Brian sort of mentioned, basically, and Phil out in sort of Hong Kong in terms of different methods of trying to get sort of money back, also compulsory purchases, etc. Sort of interesting there is this sort of slide. So this idea of a value of property, distance away from, say, a station, 500 metres, uplift of, 10.5%, basically. This is a nationwide study from 2014. I bet you anything now you could effectively double that. Oh, there we go as well. So 40% of planning applications cite Crossrail as a justification for proceeding within 1,000 metres of the station. So this is I keep plugging the company, which is all wrong. But this is a project that we're working on. We're doing a Crossrail station at Woolwich. Now, originally, let's just go back to that slide with where are we on there? Woolwich. that one there. Originally, there actually wasn't going to be a Crossrail station there, but Berkeley Homes got hold of Woolwich Arsenal. He used to make all the bombs and stuff, and we used to go around sort of dealing with other people around the world, and they were redeveloping that for sort of 2,000 homes. So what they basically said, well, we will pay for this underground box. Basically, we'll give you the money to sort of do that. Of course they're going to do it, because the uplift in value in terms of their land and their properties there is huge. They'll easily get back that several £1 million that they sort of paid for that box. But it's a start. I mean, they managed to get some money off a developer. A similar kind of, this is not actually Crossrail, but the idea of kind of pooling, land pooling again. So this is a project, Earl's Court, TfL land with railway underneath. It's a Capco project, and what they're sort of doing is they're pooling together in terms of the land, and then they're beginning to sort of share some of the profit. Shares in development profit for TfL, 37%, for Capco, it's 63%. That's only based on TfL land, though. It's not actually including the whole of the development itself, so it's still very, very small. So this whole idea about sort of land capture is very, very important. Okay, just going back to growth in this capital of ours, and the GLA have come up with these two concepts basically, which is a city in the west and a city in the east. And what they're effectively doing is looking at all current railway sort of infrastructure, and also future railway infrastructure, whether it's Crossrail or HS2 works or extensions to trams, etc. And then it's very, very small in the top left-hand corner up there, but you can sort of begin to see in terms of the uplift which they're sort of putting in terms of number of homes and number of jobs based on a development strategy around transport, basically, around public transport, and you're effectively sort of doubling that. So I'm going to show you some of the projects that we've been working on related to this. This is sort of city in the west, basically, and you can sort of see here. There's a series of I can't see actually, but in terms of we've got sort of Crossrail sort of coming in here. We've got High Speed 2, which comes into Old Oak Common and then comes into sort of Euston. We've got Crossrail 2, which goes from the Upper Lee Valley and it comes all the way down here into Kingston and into sort of Surrey as well, basically. And this is what they're sort of looking at in terms of numbers, really. So this is a project that Weston Williamson have been working on for quite a long time. This is the High Speed 2 train station at Old Oak Common. It's effectively a big 1 kilometre long underground box, and it goes off to London, Euston that way, it goes off to Birmingham that way. And when this was originally envisaged as a station, it was actually just purely an interchange station. You have the Crossrail, the fast High Speed 2 up to Birmingham, London. There'll be Crossrail platforms in here, which goes into central London and Heathrow, and then there's a Great Western Main Line to go down to lovely southwest sort of England. And it sort of sits within here, which was this greater sort of development area that we're looking at around Wormwood Scrubs. Now, the original targets for the jobs and homes, basically, in this sort of area in 2012 were 14,000 jobs, 1,500 homes. Based on the idea of TOD, whatever that sort of, transport oriented development, they've effectively gone this sort of connectivity up to 60,000 jobs, 25,000 homes, which is massive. And it's a project where my master planning team is working on at the moment, this whole kind of like sort of area. What it means for density, 600 units per hectare, which is hyperdensity, that's lower Manhattan numbers. So, this is London, this is what I think of London, sort of living there now, basically, in terms of, historic centre of London, the sort of city of London with its medieval street pattern and its huge tall skyscrapers, basically. You've got all that nonsense down at Canary Wharf, which is American sort of city planning. It's lovely, really high density, high value homes in sort of Notting Hill, really. And right next to this sort of area as well, you've got this big industrial estate, which is Park Royal. What does this mean in terms of future Manchester? What kind of place are we kind of sort of creating here? Now, fortunately, the mayor sort of set up a development corporation, the Old Oak Park Royal Development Corporation, quite sort of earlier on, with the OAPF basically, and then went on to sort of set up a local plan. Because fortunately, the majority of this land in here, all this sort of area in here, it's all railway land, so actually it all belongs to us. It's all public ownership. There's a bit of a second-hand car dealer in there. Well, it's the biggest second-hand car dealer in Europe. He's got a very big sort of site, basically, Mr. Car Giant, basically. So anyway, so when we've been looking at sort of master planning this, the beauty of it is this idea of the 5-minute city. So in the centre here, you've got your HS2, Birmingham, central London, Crossrail, Great Western Main Line, and then you've got this series of tube lines, North Acton existing, East Acton, you've got Wilson Junction, and then TfL are thinking about in a couple more overground stations, just to, in case there wasn't enough, sort of over here basically at Old Oak Common Lane and Hyde Road as well. And then you've got your sort of 5-minute walking circles basically around it. Super connected. And there, that's the Grand Union Canal, which was the original high-speed link between London and Birmingham. So just looking at sort of master planning around this and the importance of the station itself here, because the thing is about the Old Oak Common, it's all railway land, so you've got all this disconnection basically, and actually using the station to basically get better connections to a wonderful piece of the parkland here, which is the Wormerscott Scrubs basically. And then the other thing is, you know, when we've got away from that idea of it just being an interchange station about maximising the value. So this is a piece of work, master planning work we did actually for HS2, just purely for them, is to look at how we can actually maximise development value around their land. Because if the government's going to put all this money in terms of building this sort of infrastructure, you've got to have 40-storey towers there, haven't you, really, to get your money back. Now, any of these stations on the High Speed 2, High Speed 3, whatever they're going to sort of call them, they've all got sort of transport-orientated development sort of potential. You've got that sort of super fast, you know, London to sort of Birmingham, 45 minutes, I don't know, is it Manchester an hour or something like that? I mean, that's fantastic, 2 hours at the moment. But then it's actually questioning, I mean, what sort of places are these really? Because most of them go into existing settlements, really. And one we've been looking at here, which is the East Midlands Hub, which actually sits equidistant between the great cities of Derby and sort of Nottingham. It comes through here at sort of Totton. At the moment it's just 2 up, 2 down houses, bungalows and things like that. And you can say, well actually what do you want to create there? Because Nottingham don't want Canary Wharf there. You know, they don't want any retail centre there because it's going to take all the emphasis away from their sort of city. Same with sort of Derby as well. So you know, personally I'd have shifted it a bit further down, stuck it somewhere near the airport and created a whole new city. You know, there, right next to the airport, because otherwise, you know, the connectivity is very poor there, basically. And that's what you don't want to end up happening. So this is High Speed 1. So that's Ebbsfleet International in Kent, which opened in 2007. It's 14 minutes to central London, bish bash bosh right in there, and then less than 2 hours to central, and it's 9,000 car parking spaces, basically. That's a high-speed rail link to Europe. You can be, you know, 2 hours into Paris. So this is another project we're working on, which is Crossrail 2, which is sort of north-south. It goes up right at the top, which is Hertfordshire, Broxbourne, all the way basically down into Surrey at the bottom there. Looking at sort of character areas really around these sort of stations, trying to understand that. This is an example of sort of Clapham Junction, really. It's an existing station, but we're effectively putting in an underground Crossrail link in there to help in terms of sort of connectivity and also to help actually relieve pressure on these railway lines because there's too many people using them. Effectively, to build these underground train stations as well, you need very, very big work sites, digging holes in the ground, getting sort of shafts out, etc. Very disruptive, basically, for the local communities. And just like looking as well, I mean, obviously the beauty about railway stations is that, you know, you've got great long-term sort of connectivity and distance apart, but also the big barriers in the environment. Trying to understand, you know, how people actually get to them, what the existing, you know, public transport connections are like around them. Because the station in itself is no good if you haven't got the buses, you know, the cycle routes, etc., to, you know, beautiful walking routes to actually just get people to use them sort of properly. And even down to the detail of, you know, where the buses, where people actually sort of come out, where the buses are, taxis, even, you know, something as pragmatic as a bus stand. I mean, fortunately in London you've got this one, and hopefully we'll get it soon in the north, which is Transport for London, Transport for the North. You know, they basically tell the bus operators what to do and in terms of frequency and things like that. But then bus operators need places for their drivers to sort of stand and stuff and go to the lavatory and have a sort of cup of tea. So it's basically about getting all these sort of intermodal facilities connected into the station, even with cycling in as well. I'm going to rattle through that. Was that the end of time? Sorry. And just looking at how it sort of connects in with potential sort of development areas around the station. Wimbledon's another one, which is about, it's about the disruption. King's Road, you see, was an unwanted gift by Felicity Kendall. There was effectively, we're going to put a Crossrail 2 station underground there, But the poor people of Kensington to Chelsea would have to go through 10 years of big trucks coming and going. And most people actually, they don't want that. You know, if you would have thought actually a beautiful new station, they would. This is Kingston into the south. They kind of strike it lucky, really. All those yellow ones, for them, are potential new Crossrail 2 stations. But again, this is a very, very low density area of London. And they're quite happy as a sort of a market town, sort of borough, really. And they're kind of worried that something like Transport for London are putting a lot of pressure on them to, you know, provide how many thousand homes. This is Enfield in the north, basically. M25 up there. These are potential Crossrail stations, but also next to industry. And then it brings into question the whole idea about sort of land use. These big industrial sheds you can't really integrate within a residential-led mixed-use development. Smaller industry, perhaps, really. So where does all this go? You know, there's a jam donut factory there which supplies London. You know, there's all these sandwich food, etc. So they're all London services, really. So it's important to sort of understand the land use around them as well, and whether there's new typologies basically where you can stack industries to actually intensify sort of land use. I'm just going to finish now really quick. It's actually a quite nice little story here, which is about, so this is Low Moor, South Bradford, Oakenshaw, where I originally sort of come from, basically. And when I was sort of growing up as a kid, Mr. Beecham here, he was kind of closing down all the railways. So 5,000 miles of railway go. Over 2,000 miles of 2,000 stations go as well, basically. And we're building this instead, you know, which is Le Corbusier's dream, wasn't it? It was about cities about the car, really, rather than, you know, public transport. And anyway, recently they reopened the station at Low Moor, £10 million. It's a lot of money, is that, actually, for a couple of platforms, a car park for 100 cars. Great news story, Telegraph in August, their recent football match. Local reporter, the George pub was rammed. This is the George pub here. I used to drink there when I was underage, when I was a young lad, basically. So it's bringing, you know, economy to the local area, really. And there's land around it as well. There's a lot of brownfield land around there. And there's one of the biggest chemical plants in West Yorkshire up there as well. Anyway, what's good about this is there's your ped shed that sort of Brian was going on about, sort of 1 kilometre, about 12-minute walk. My mum still lives down here, basically. So what she can do is she can get on a bus outside her house, and it goes all the way up to the sort of station. It's about sort of like 6 minutes, basically. And she can sort of get on the station, on the train. And then it's not the best service on the planet, but every 4 times a day there's a direct journey between Low Moor and King's Cross, basically. It takes 3 hours. Admittedly, it's not, you know, fast. It trundles through sort of Yorkshire, gets to Doncaster, and it goes like sort of fast. So effectively, there's my mum, you see. So she got on the train at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, basically. She was down by 11. We walked around the Royal Parks, and then I took her for afternoon tea at the Ritz, basically. I mean, if there was ever a picture with, you know, advocating investment in rail, that's it, isn't it? Anyway, thank you very much.